saying, as always, my words of encouragement really come personally for me. They're words which I need to hear, and they're words which I hope will resonate with you as well. I think if I'm honest with you, I'd have to say that this Sunday has probably been the hardest Sunday that I've had to prepare for. Which is strange in a way, because when you think about it, Easter and Christmas are the two times of the year when at least there's some tacit acknowledgement in the world in which we live about the role that Christianity plays in our society. A time when everything which is going around should in some way lend itself to the gospel message, and which forms obviously the basis of our faith. After all, every Sunday our words of encouragement lead us to the bread and wine, don't they? They speak of the life given for us. They pierce our thoughts as we remember the hope of the resurrection. They transport us forward to a different time and place when all tears will be wiped away and our fears will be overcome. And finally, we'll understand that peace which surpasses all understanding. Every Sunday morning, if you like, is what you might call a giving of the Easter message. So in some ways, this morning, this weekend of any, should be one of the easiest to prepare for. But we come this morning and our hearts are tinged with sadness. As a family, we're grieving. As Paul said in his letter to the Corinthians, we are all part of the one body, so if one part suffers, well, every part suffers with it. And I've struggled with reconciling, on the one hand, the joy of the resurrection with the sadness that we feel around Levi's death. I feel that it's at times like this when our faith is truly put to the test, isn't it? These are the times when we are compelled to honestly consider how strongly we hold our convictions. How do we reconcile our grief with the love of God? How strong is our faith? It struck me that if we have a faith which is built on impossible perfectionism or idealism, where Jesus is untouchable in his perfection and unapproachable in his righteousness, it makes it difficult to make that faith real. How does it support us in our grief? Perhaps more importantly, how does it help us to support those who most need it? I saw a message which Sue Hicks posted in the last week, and apologies to Sue, I didn't tell her I was going to read this, but I think that it really cut to the core of my thoughts. And she said this. She said, "Oh boy, this is hard advice. We all want to make it better, but no platitudes, no quoting Bible verses, no amount of talk will make it better. Just showing up and listening and sitting with someone in their grief is so much harder." It's the difference between an ideological faith and a practical faith. And as we see this morning, everything about Jesus was built on a practical, real, honest and personal relationship with us. And so this morning I want to consider Jesus as that real and approachable person. So often we elevate Jesus to this position that I don't believe he asks us to. Yes, we should absolutely revere him as God's own Son, as the one who lived a perfect and sinless life, and we should acknowledge that he sits at the right hand of God. The problem is that the more that we elevate him in our mind's eye, the further we remove him from us. And we can start to build these imaginary walls between us and him, and we believe that to be like him, it's just not possible. And so we focus on what separates us from him, what makes us less than him, perhaps how we are un-Christ-like, when what he wants is us to remember him as if we're looking at the person who is sitting in the seat next to us. So just for a few seconds, look around you. Look at the person sitting next to you, or the person they may be in front or behind. Maybe they're across the aisle from you. Maybe they're across the platform. Think about Jesus sitting where that person is sitting. That's the proximity of Jesus to us. So for a moment, let's remove all the things which we've used to separate us from Jesus, and let's make him as real as that person sitting next to you. There's no pretenses with Jesus. There's no showmanship, no pretentiousness. His words are spoken to our hearts, not simply said to our faces. He didn't dress to impress. He showed up and he cared. That's the practical reality of Jesus, which will help us at times like this. This morning, I want us to find that level of practical Christianity that's more concerned about how we demonstrate our love to one another than perhaps what people think of us as we're doing it. I want us to be comfortable accepting that we can be like Christ, at least in some parts of our lives, rather than being afraid that we can't and focusing on where we fail. I want to take a few snippets from Jesus' life, and I want to start in Matthew 3, which records the mission of John and the baptism of Christ. And John was preaching ahead of his time, wasn't he? He was challenging the religion, and yet John too was awestruck with Jesus, and we know that he was preaching to the Pharisees. And in verse 7, as he's baptising people, he sees the Pharisees and Sadducees, and he says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance. And do not think to yourselves, you can say, well, we're okay, we have Abraham as our father." He's very direct with them. And he talks about the baptism. He says, "I baptise you with water for repentance. But after me comes one who is more powerful than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry." That was his take on Jesus. He wasn't even worthy to carry his sandals. But then we find a couple of verses later in verse 13 that Jesus needs to readjust John's mindset around this. Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptised by John, but John tries to deter him, saying, "Well, I need to be baptised by you, and do you come to me?" John couldn't fathom the fact that he would be there baptising Jesus. He held Jesus in this place that was almost unapproachable. And so Jesus adjusts his perception of the situation, and it becomes the theme of his ministry as he takes what people thought they knew and he changes them. He peels back the veneer of their beliefs and instead lays bare the law of love, which ran through everything that the Old Testament stood on. And so if we follow on in Matthew's record, we come in a couple of chapters to Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Mount, and remember that starts with the Beatitudes, and perhaps we might recall a couple of weeks ago Ben Saxon talking to us and demonstrating his artistic skills as he showed the ways that we could recall and think about the Beatitudes. And he drew that picture for us, the cottage next to the stream, the smoke from the chimney. And he talked to us about the Beatitudes, the people who are blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And Jesus moves on from that, and he takes the very fabric of Jewish daily living at that time, the law, and he dismantles it for the crowd, not in terms of what it said, but how people understood it. And he takes some pretty common issues and he talks to his audience. And he talks about anger and adultery and divorce and revenge. He talks about how we feel about people that we don't really like and about looking after those in need. And he talks about religious practices and money and possessions and judgmental attitudes and the power of prayer and how we act towards one another and whether or not we choose to be a child of God. He talks about what it means to follow him and the importance of having a solid foundation for our faith. And you know, as I read through those, a couple of things strike me. First of all, it sounds like a list of themes that you might hear from this platform or Bible class or youth groups during the year. There's nothing new there. This is all stuff which affects us just as much today as it did then. And secondly, it called to mind for me some of the words of the writers to the Hebrew. In Hebrews chapter 4, In verse 14, the writer to the Hebrews says this, talking about Jesus: "Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathise with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." Now, considering these two passages together is going to trigger either a degree of discomfort or an overwhelming sigh of relief, because Matthew's recorded all these issues which people are struggling with. These are the day-to-day problems which we deal with. They're the issues we bring our faith to in order to try and do better. And yet the writer to the Hebrews tells us that at some time or another, Jesus struggled with exactly the same sort of issues. If we have an ideological faith, that's going to leave us a little incredulous. If we simply accept that Jesus is perfect and so far removed from our reality, how comfortable can we honestly feel that he was tempted with the same issues that we are? On the other hand, if we have a practical faith, a faith which acknowledges the human nature of Jesus, then this helps us to connect to him personally. We have a shared experience. We can accept the reality of Jesus struggling with sinful tendencies in the same way that we do. It means that everything he did for us in his sacrifice, he did knowing from personal experience just how hard it was to overcome temptation. He didn't lay down his life for us because we were good people, but because he had been there and he knew how desperately we need his help. And brothers and sisters, we need this to be the case. The power of Jesus is that he gets us. He knows what we're struggling with. If he didn't, then where would be the value of his sacrifice for us? If Jesus wasn't tempted the same as we are, we'd be left saying, well, of course he was perfect. He didn't have to deal with what we do. He was the Son of God. He had it easy. But the power of the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings of Christ through his parables and interactions is such because Jesus had experienced what he was talking about. Each of these issues in the Sermon on the Mount, they weren't talked about in the abstract. They resulted from Jesus' own experience. So when Jesus talks about anger, he knows from experience the sorts of situation which are going to lead to that. You know, that there's a sense of being personally wronged in some way, that something unjust has occurred. I wonder what the situations were for Jesus where he found himself in that circumstance. Perhaps somebody said something disparaging about his parents, a comment about the manner of conception, that he was conceived before Mary and Joseph were married. Maybe, like Moses seeing the Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian, maybe Jesus saw a Jew being beaten by a Roman. There must have been many of these situations at that time, and I wonder what influence Joseph had on Jesus in all this as he was growing up. Because we don't know much about Joseph, do we? But we do have this lovely little snippet right back in Matthew chapter 1. It's beautiful to see a situation where Joseph could have felt so slighted, or that he had been dealt with unjustly in some way. I imagine that when he discovered Mary was pregnant, he could rightfully have been very upset. And yet Matthew records his response in verse 19 of chapter 1. That his mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Bear in mind, Joseph didn't know that this was the manner of her conception at that stage. And Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet he didn't want to expose her to public disgrace. What an example. I can't help feel this example tells us so much about Joseph's character, and perhaps instructs us a little about why God chose this particular household in which to raise his son. In a situation in which it's easy to believe Joseph could have been every right to upset, we see his selflessness as he was concerned more about the impact on Mary. And we see this selfless approach run through much of Jesus' teachings, don't we? And it's summed up in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7 and verse 12, where we have that golden rule, the law of love. So in everything, Jesus said, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. I imagine that he might have seen that running through the life of Joseph as he grew up. I think it's easy for us to look at the challenges we face today and consider that they're unique to us. But we know that Solomon says that there's nothing new under the sun. And it's easy for us to question when we're feeling at our least worthy. Well, surely Jesus didn't get tempted in the same way which I do. And yet here he talks about greed and lust and selfishness. And by the time Jesus reached his ministry, he had a lot of what these days we might call life experience. His teachings demonstrate his grounding in day-to-day life. He saw and witnessed life just as we see and experience it today. And by the time John baptised him, he'd been able to come to this understanding of the Old Testament law, how it was used and how people had missed the point of so much of what God had been trying to teach through it. And so his parables brought everyday situations to life in a way which people could relate to, because Jesus was a relatable figure. He spoke in the lingo of the day in a way which the locals understood. However perfect Jesus was, he wasn't immune to feeling the pressures of the world in which we lived. He knew what temptation was. And he tells us what it's like to be us, because he is one of us. If he was standing here this morning instead of me, I wonder what he'd be teaching. No doubt it would be something which we'd be able to relate to personally. We might be a little bit disconcerted about how he cuts through and gets to the point. But he could do that because he knew what we were dealing with. He might tell us the parable of the public servant who did good because that's what he was paid to do. Perhaps he might talk about the ecclesia who preached the gospel but had a lot of wealth while the homeless perished on the streets outside in the depths of winter. Perhaps he might share with us later how he had handled the same troubles himself. I don't know what you struggle with, but I do know that Jesus has been there too. Maybe it's a search for constant likes on social media and the distraction which that brings. How could Jesus possibly understand that desire for fame and ego? We'll think about Matthew chapter 4, right at the end there, where it talks about what Jesus was doing and that his fame spread to Syria and that crowds of people followed him. Jesus' fame spread before him. When he entered the Jerusalem before the Last Supper, he was feted by the crowds. He could have entered triumphantly and pleased the populace by overthrowing the Romans. He could have had it all. He knows what it's like to have to deal with the desire for attention. Perhaps it's materialism. Well, of course, Jesus didn't have to deal with that, did he? Didn't he say the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head? Well, I think the fact that Jesus could draw to that fact so quickly suggested it was something which had crossed his mind before. Jesus lived in a time when there was the same insidious obsession with sex. We knew that there were prostitutes. He knew who they were. And undoubtedly he would have seen the Roman shrines to sex of one form or another as he grew up. And Jesus would have been exposed to the same temptations as any of us are today. You know, in Luke 7, we're given the story of Jesus dining with Simon the Pharisee. I think it's a beautiful picture of how Jesus deals with us personally and how he understands who we are. He's speaking to Simon. And Simon has invited him to have dinner with him. And the woman, the prostitute, learns that Jesus is eating at the Pharisee's house. And she comes there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And we know that she weeps and wets his feet and washes his feet with her tears. And then she wipes them with her hair and kisses them and pours perfume. And Simon's response is this. He said, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is. Jesus didn't see what she was, though, did he? He didn't see a prostitute. He saw who she was. He saw a sinner who was looking for forgiveness. And he forgave her. And what a powerful that experience must have been. Because as he forgives her, he's looking at her, but speaking to Simon. And he says, as he's looking at her, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you didn't give me water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown." Could you imagine Jesus looking you in the eyes as he said those words? This love, this connection to people in such a personal manner, this is what epitomises our relationship with Jesus. We're not called to be distant. We're not called to feel unworthy or that we're beyond salvation. We're called to have confidence in him, and that we can rest assured in his love for us because he is as real and as close to us as a person sitting in the chair right next to us. You know, in his final moments when he was abused by one of the men who was crucified with him and asked for salvation by another, wouldn't it have been so much easier just to ignore them? Surely he had the right to deal with his own grief and pain at that stage. And instead, he sees a man asking for help. And Jesus doesn't deny him. He doesn't see a criminal. He sees a man looking for hope. And Jesus gives him that hope because that's what ran through every element of his life. And for us, it means the comfort that we give is not platitudes. It is, as Sue said, the sitting down with those who mourn. It's listening to one another. Once when I was in a difficult situation, I remember a brother holding out his hands to me and saying, "David, these are the hands of God." Our love for one another is practical and real because our brother Jesus is practical and real. He doesn't relate to us because he was human. He understands us because he dealt with the same trials that we do. Sorry. Thanks, Sue. He doesn't relate to us because he was human. He understands us because he dealt with the same trials that we do. Every time you read a lesson that Jesus was teaching, it was taught because he had learned it first. We come now to meet Jesus risen, not as the Almighty Son of God who sits at God's right hand, unapproachable in glory and righteous perfection, but rather as our brother, as a real man who faced the same trials that we do. This is who we come to meet now as we partake in this bread and wine. We look back, as Paul says in Corinthians, to examine ourselves, and we can look forward to that time when we will see Jesus for the first time, to meet him face to face. Just as he met Mary, as we read this morning, and the other women, and he spoke that word and she recognised him. What a moment that must have been. That will be our experience as well. Just as he appeared to the disciples and then to Thomas. What I love about that is that he's going to recognise us, just as he recognised them. Because he will have seen our faces so many times throughout our lives. Every time we call on him for help, he's there with us. He will know who we are. So, however we approach this meal together, let's remember that it was not some supernatural being who was impossibly perfect that died for us. It was Jesus, the guy who is as real as the person sitting next to us, who showed his love for us. Let's then take his example of meeting people for who they are and where they are as our template and do the same. It's time for us to be as practical in our love and care and support for each other as Jesus was. Let us then, in the days until we see him again, love one another as he loved us.